June 1941. Washington, D.C. The air in the War Department was thick with cigarette smoke and uncertainty. Outside, the city moved as if the world wasn't tearing itself apart across two oceans. Inside room 2047, Colonel William Donovan sat alone, staring at a stack of intelligence reports that had arrived over the past 72 hours. He wasn't reading them anymore. He had memorized every line. The reports spoke of German troop movements along the Soviet border, massive, unprecedented concentrations. 3 million men. 3,000 tanks. 7,000 artillery pieces. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like reading about geological formations rather than human decisions. But Donovan knew better. Numbers like that didn't gather by accident. He had spent the last 6 months trying to convince anyone who would listen that something catastrophic was coming. The British had their intelligence. The Soviets had theirs. And the Americans, officially neutral, officially distant, had Donovan, a lawyer turned intelligence officer who understood that wars were won or lost long before the first shot was fired. The problem was simple: nobody wanted to believe him. President Roosevelt was walking a tightrope. Congress was isolationist. The American public wanted nothing to do with Europe's wars. And Stalin, stubborn, paranoid Stalin, refused to accept that Hitler would break their non-aggression pact. Every warning sent through diplomatic channels had been dismissed as British propaganda designed to drag the Soviets into conflict. Donovan lit another cigarette and walked to the window. Across the Potomac, the lights of the Capitol glowed softly in the summer dusk. Somewhere out there, families were having dinner. Children were playing in yards. People were living as if tomorrow would be just like today. He envied them. The waiting game. For months, Donovan had been assembling pieces of a puzzle that nobody wanted to see completed. His network of informants, diplomats, journalists, businessmen, refugees, had been feeding him fragments of information that, when combined, painted an undeniable picture. A Swedish businessman reported seeing endless trains moving east through occupied Poland, all carrying military equipment. A Turkish diplomat mentioned unusual activity at German embassies across Eastern Europe, staff being recalled, documents being burned. A Polish resistance fighter described German officers surveying Soviet border defenses, taking photographs, making notes. Each piece meant nothing on its own. Together, they screamed invasion. But Washington wasn't listening. The official position was caution. The unofficial position was denial. America had spent 2 years watching Europe devour itself, and the prevailing wisdom was that getting involved would be a mistake of historic proportions. Donovan understood the logic. He even sympathized with it. But logic didn't change reality. He had tried going through official channels. He had briefed the Secretary of War, who listened politely and did nothing. He had spoken with Roosevelt's advisors, who thanked him for his diligence and filed his reports away. He had even attempted to reach the president directly, only to be told that Mr. Roosevelt had more pressing concerns. So Donovan waited. He waited through April, as German reconnaissance flights increased along the Soviet border. He waited through May, as Wehrmacht divisions completed their redeployment from France to Poland. He waited through early June, as the final preparations fell into place like dominoes arranged by an invisible hand. And with each passing day, the weight of knowing grew heavier. June 21, 1941. 11:47 p.m. The phone on Donovan's desk rang. It was late, too late for routine calls. He had been working through the night again, cross-referencing reports, updating maps, preparing briefings that nobody would read. His secretary had gone home hours ago. The building was nearly empty. He picked up the receiver. Donovan. The voice on the other end was breathless, urgent. It belonged to Sam Woods, a commercial attaché station in Berlin who occasionally passed along information that didn't fit neatly into official diplomatic cables. "Colonel, it's happening. Right now. German forces crossed the border 30 minutes ago. Luftwaffe strikes across Western Soviet Union. It's massive, everything we predicted. Donovan said nothing for 3 full seconds. He had known this was coming. Had known for months. Had tried to warn everyone who would listen. And yet, hearing the words spoken aloud felt like stepping off a cliff. Confirmed, he asked quietly. Multiple sources. Embassy staff can hear explosions from here. Radio intercepts confirm Wehrmacht units engaging Soviet positions from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This isn't a probe, Colonel. This is total war. Donovan set down his cigarette. His hand was steady. Thank you, Sam. Keep the line open. I'll need updates every hour. He hung up and sat perfectly still. Outside his window, Washington slept. Across the Atlantic, 3 million men were pouring into Soviet territory. Tanks were rolling. Planes were bombing. Cities were burning. And in this quiet office, thousands of miles from the violence, William Donovan understood that the world had just changed forever. The moment. He didn't rush. There was no point. The invasion had already begun. Nothing he did in the next 5 minutes would alter that fact. Instead, he walked to his wall map, a detailed chart of Europe marked with colored pins representing troop positions, supply lines, strategic objectives. He had been updating it obsessively for months, tracking the German buildup like a meteorologist watching a hurricane form. Now the hurricane had made landfall. He placed a single black pin on the Soviet border. Then another. Then another. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. Each pin represented a German army group. North. Center. South. The arrows of invasion were clear now, undeniable, carved into the map like scars. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at what he had created. It was beautiful in a terrible way, the geometry of destruction, the mathematics of ambition. Hitler had gambled everything on this single throw of the dice. If Germany won, the Soviet Union would collapse. If Germany lost, the Reich would be crushed between 2 fronts. And America, neutral, distant, reluctant America, would have to choose. Donovan picked up the phone again. This time, he dialed a direct line to the White House. It rang 4 times before someone answered. This is Colonel Donovan. I need to speak with the president. Immediately. There was a pause. Then, sir, it's nearly midnight. The president is. I know what time it is, Donovan said quietly. Wake him. The certainty. 20 minutes later, Donovan was in a car heading toward the White House. The streets were empty. The city was dark. Above him, stars burned in a cloudless sky, indifferent to the chaos unfolding half a world away. He thought about all the warnings he had sent. All the reports he had written. All the meetings where he had been politely ignored. None of it mattered now. The invasion had happened. The war had expanded. And whether America liked it or not, the equation had changed. Because Hitler had made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, the invasion itself was brilliantly executed. But a strategic one. A fatal one. He had opened a second front against an enemy with limitless space and limitless manpower. He had committed Germany to a war of annihilation against a nation that could absorb losses that would destroy any other country. He had assumed that Soviet resistance would collapse in weeks, that Stalin's regime would crumble, that victory would come quickly and decisively. Donovan knew better. This war wouldn't end in weeks. It would end in years. And when it did, Germany would be broken. The car pulled up to the White House gates. Donovan stepped out, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, Roosevelt would be waiting. And for the first time in months, someone would finally listen. Because the world had changed. And America would have to change with it. June 22, 1941. 2:17 a.m. The White House. The Oval Office was dimly lit. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat behind his desk, a blanket draped over his legs, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had been woken from sleep 20 minutes earlier, dressed hastily, and wheeled into the office by an aide who understood that some news couldn't wait until morning. Donovan stood across from him, still wearing the same rumpled uniform he'd had on for the past 16 hours. Between them lay a map of Eastern Europe, marked with the pins Donovan had placed earlier that night. Roosevelt studied the map in silence. His fingers traced the arrows of invasion, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south toward Kiev and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The scale of it was staggering. "How long have you known?" Roosevelt asked finally. "That it would happen?" "Months, Mr. President." "That it would happen tonight?" 3 hours. Roosevelt looked up. His eyes were sharp despite the hour. "And Stalin?" "Ignored every warning. British intelligence tried. We tried. Even his own generals tried. He convinced himself it was disinformation designed to provoke him into breaking the pact with Germany." "Paranoia," Roosevelt said quietly. "Or arrogance," Donovan replied. "Maybe both." Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Soviet soldiers were dying by the thousands. Cities were burning. The largest invasion in human history was unfolding in real time, and here in Washington, 2 men sat in a quiet room trying to understand what it meant. "What do you need from me?" Roosevelt asked. Donovan had prepared for this question. He had rehearsed his answer a dozen times on the drive over. But now, standing in front of the President of the United States, he found himself speaking from instinct rather than preparation. Permission to expand intelligence operations. "We need eyes on the ground, not just in Europe, but in Moscow. We need to know how long the Soviets can hold. We need to understand German supply lines, troop morale, strategic objectives. And we need to do it quickly, because this war is going to move faster than anyone expects." Roosevelt nodded slowly. "Congress won't authorize direct involvement. You know that. I'm not asking for troops, Mr. President. I'm asking for information. Let me build a network. Let me coordinate with the British. Let me do what needs to be done before it's too late." There was a long pause. Roosevelt looked at the map again, his expression unreadable. "Do it," he said finally. Quietly. Unofficially. "And keep me informed." Donovan felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Yes, sir." Roosevelt picked up a pen and made a note on a pad of paper. Then he looked up at Donovan with an expression that was almost sad. "You understand what this means, don't you, Colonel? Hitler has just made the same mistake Napoleon made. He's invaded Russia in summer, thinking he can win before winter comes. And when winter does come, and he'll find out what every conqueror before him learned: Russia doesn't lose wars on its own soil. It absorbs them." "I know, sir." "Then you also know that when Germany finally breaks, we'll be the ones who have to pick up the pieces. This war just became our war, whether we're ready for it or not." Donovan said nothing. There was nothing to say. Roosevelt dismissed him with a nod, and Donovan left the Oval Office as quietly as he had entered. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Streetlights flickered off. Early commuters emerged from metro stations. Newspaper trucks rumbled through empty streets, carrying headlines that would shock a nation still clinging to the illusion of distance. But Donovan wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about what came next. July 1941. 9 days later. The War Department had become a hive of controlled chaos. Maps covered every wall. Telephones rang constantly. Officers moved through hallways with the purposeful urgency of men who understood that every decision mattered. Donovan had been given a small office on the 3rd floor. Officially, he was still just a colonel coordinating intelligence assessments. Unofficially, he had become the central node in an expanding network of informants, analysts, and operatives who were trying to make sense of a war that defied easy analysis. The news from the Eastern Front was catastrophic. German forces had advanced over 200 miles in the first week. Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The Luftwaffe had achieved near-total air superiority. Cities that had stood for centuries were being reduced to rubble. And yet, the Soviets kept fighting. That was the part that surprised everyone, not that they were losing, but that they hadn't collapsed. Every military analyst in Washington had predicted that Stalin's regime would crumble within weeks. The purges of the 1930s had gutted the Red Army's officer corps. Soviet equipment was outdated. Their logistics were a disaster. By every rational measure, they should have surrendered already. But they hadn't. Donovan spent his days reading reports that painted a picture of chaos and resilience in equal measure. Soviet soldiers fought to the death in hopeless positions. Civilians evacuated entire factories, moving them piece by piece beyond the Ural Mountains. Partisan groups formed behind German lines, sabotaging supply convoys and communication networks. It wasn't organized. It wasn't efficient. But it was relentless. And slowly, very slowly, Donovan began to understand something that would change everything. July 18, 1941. 4:32 p.m. The report arrived in a plain manila envelope, delivered by courier from the Office of Naval Intelligence. Donovan opened it alone in his office, the door locked, the blinds drawn. It was a translated intercept of a German military communication, captured by British signals intelligence and passed along through back channels. The message was brief, almost mundane, a logistics officer requesting additional fuel supplies for Army Group Center. But it was the tone that caught Donovan's attention. The officer wasn't confident. He was worried. Donovan read the message 3 times, then pulled out a folder containing similar intercepts from the past 2 weeks. He laid them out on his desk in chronological order and studied them like a detective examining evidence. June 28, request for replacement tank treads. Losses higher than anticipated. July 3, inquiry about winter clothing supplies. Concern about extended campaign timeline. July 10, report of partisan activity disrupting rail lines. Request for additional security units. July 15, complaint about fuel shortages delaying advance on Moscow. Individually, they meant nothing. Collectively, they told a story. The Germans were winning. But they weren't winning fast enough. Donovan stood and walked to his wall map. He measured distances with a ruler, calculated supply line lengths, estimated fuel consumption rates. The numbers didn't lie. Germany had planned for a 6-week campaign. They were now entering week 4, and they were still hundreds of miles from Moscow. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Their tanks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. And every day they spent fighting in Soviet territory was a day closer to the autumn rains, and the winter that would follow. For the first time since the invasion began, Donovan allowed himself to consider a possibility he had barely dared to imagine. Germany might lose. Not immediately. Not this year. Maybe not even next year. But eventually. The shift. He picked up the phone and called a number he had memorized weeks earlier. It rang twice before a British accented voice answered. Stevenson. William Stevenson was the head of British Security Coordination in New York, officially a diplomat, unofficially Britain's chief intelligence officer in the Western Hemisphere. He and Donovan had been sharing information for months, building a relationship that existed in the gray zone between alliance and neutrality. It's Donovan. I need to talk. Secure line. Go ahead. The Germans are slowing down. Not collapsing, slowing. Supply issues. Logistics problems. Partisan resistance. They're still advancing, but the momentum is breaking. There was a pause on the other end. Then, we're seeing the same thing. Churchill thinks they've lost their chance to knock out Moscow before winter. What happens if they don't take Moscow? Then they spend winter in Soviet territory, exposed, undersupplied, fighting an enemy that has nothing to lose. And when spring comes, they'll be weaker. And the Soviets will be stronger. Donovan closed his eyes. The pieces were falling into place. How long until your people think Stalin can stabilize the front? 6 months. Maybe less if we can get supplies to them. Lend-Lease is being debated in Parliament now. If it passes, we start shipping equipment through Murmansk and Vladivostok. And if America joins? Stevenson's voice was quiet but certain. Then Germany loses. Not quickly, but inevitably. Donovan hung up and sat in the gathering darkness of his office. Outside, the city was alive with evening traffic. Inside, he felt the weight of certainty settling over him like a physical thing. The war had changed. Hitler had gambled everything on speed, on shock, on the belief that the Soviet Union would shatter like glass under the hammer of Blitzkrieg. But glass hadn't shattered. It had bent, cracked, fractured. And now it was beginning to hold. December 1941. Washington, D.C. Snow fell softly over the capital, muffling the city in a blanket of white silence. It was the kind of winter evening that made the war feel distant, a problem happening somewhere else, to someone else. But in room 2047, William Donovan knew better. 6 months had passed since the invasion began. 6 months of watching the Eastern Front evolve from a German blitzkrieg into something else entirely, a grinding, brutal war of attrition that consumed men and material at a rate that defied comprehension. The maps on Donovan's walls had changed. The confident arrows of June had been replaced by jagged lines that advanced, stalled, retreated, and advanced again. Moscow still stood, besieged but unbroken. Leningrad was encircled but fighting. The southern front had collapsed and reformed a dozen times. And the Germans, the unstoppable Wehrmacht that had conquered France in 6 weeks, were freezing to death in the Russian winter. Donovan had spent the autumn watching his predictions come true with a precision that gave him no satisfaction. The German advance had slowed in August, stalled in September, and ground to a halt in October as the autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud. By November, temperatures had dropped below freezing, and German soldiers were fighting in summer uniforms because nobody had planned for a winter campaign. The Soviets, meanwhile, had done the impossible. They had held. Not elegantly. Not efficiently. But with a stubbornness that transformed military disaster into strategic survival. They traded space for time, cities for months, millions of lives for the chance to rebuild their shattered armies behind the Ural Mountains. And now, in December, as snow buried the Eastern Front under 3 feet of white, the Soviets were doing something even more remarkable. They were counterattacking. December 5, 1941. 9:14 a.m. The intelligence report sat on Donovan's desk, marked urgent in red ink. It had arrived overnight from the American embassy in Moscow, transmitted through encrypted channels and decoded by Navy cryptographers who understood that some information couldn't wait. Donovan read it twice, then a third time to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. Soviet forces launch major counteroffensive west of Moscow. German Army Group Center in retreat. First significant Soviet victory since invasion began. Stalin personally directing operations. German casualties estimated in tens of thousands. He set the report down carefully, as if it might explode. For 6 months, every piece of news from the Eastern Front had been a variation on the same theme: German advance, Soviet retreat, catastrophic losses, desperate resistance. The narrative had been so consistent that it had become background noise, tragic, terrible, but predictable. This was different. This was the Soviets pushing back. Donovan stood and walked to his map. He found Moscow, traced the defensive lines around the city, estimated the distances involved. The Germans had come within 20 miles of the capital, close enough to see the Kremlin spires through binoculars. And now they were being driven back. Not routed. Not destroyed. But forced to retreat for the first time since the invasion began. It was a small victory in the context of the larger war. The Germans still occupied vast territories. They still held Leningrad under siege. They still controlled Ukraine's industrial heartland. But the myth of German invincibility had just died in the snow outside Moscow. And myths, Donovan knew, mattered more than most people realized. The weight of timing. He was still studying the map when his secretary knocked on the door. "Colonel? You have a call from the White House. They're saying it's urgent." Donovan glanced at his watch. 9:47 a.m. Roosevelt rarely called this early unless something significant had happened. He picked up the phone. "Donovan." The voice on the other end belonged to Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor and the man who often served as the president's eyes and ears when official channels were too slow or too political. "Colonel, the president needs you at the White House immediately. Don't ask questions. Just come." The line went dead. Donovan stood motionless for 3 seconds, his mind racing through possibilities. The Soviet counteroffensive was significant, but it wasn't urgent enough to warrant a summons like this. Something else had happened. Something big. He grabbed his coat and was out the door in less than a minute. December 7th, 1941. 10:23 a.m. The Oval Office was crowded. Secretary of War Henry Stimson stood near the window, his face ashen. Secretary of State Cordell Hull sat in a chair, staring at nothing. Several military officers Donovan didn't recognize were clustered around Roosevelt's desk, speaking in low, urgent voices. Roosevelt himself sat perfectly still, a telegram in his hand, his expression unreadable. When Donovan entered, the room fell silent. "Colonel," Roosevelt said quietly. "Close the door." Donovan did. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud. Roosevelt held up the telegram. His hand trembled slightly, whether from anger or shock, Donovan couldn't tell. 2 hours ago, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Our Pacific Fleet has been crippled. Casualties are in the thousands. We're at war. The words hung in the air like smoke. Donovan felt the world tilt beneath him. He had spent 6 months tracking the European war, analyzing German movements, predicting Soviet responses. He had prepared for a dozen different scenarios involving Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill. He had not prepared for this. "How bad?" he asked. Stimson answered, his voice hollow. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Over 2,000 dead. Most of our Pacific air power gone. The Japanese hit us while their diplomats were still in Washington negotiating peace terms. Donovan's mind raced. Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet. Japan. And suddenly, the war he had been watching from a distance wasn't distant anymore. It was here. Roosevelt set down the telegram and looked directly at Donovan. "I'm going to address Congress tomorrow. We'll declare war on Japan. And when we do, Germany will almost certainly declare war on us in support of their Axis alliance. Which means that in 72 hours, we'll be fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans against enemies who have been preparing for this while we've been debating neutrality." He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over the room. "I need you to do something for me, Colonel. I need you to build an intelligence service, a real one, not the patchwork we've been operating with. I need analysts, operatives, networks, coordination with the British and the Soviets. I need to know what our enemies are planning before they plan it. And I need it done yesterday." Donovan felt the certainty crystallize in his chest, the same certainty he had felt 6 months earlier when the phone rang and Sam Woods told him the invasion had begun. "Yes, sir." The convergence. That night, Donovan returned to his office and stood before his maps. The world had changed again, not gradually this time, but in a single violent instant that had rewritten every assumption about America's role in the war. He thought about the Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow. He thought about German soldiers freezing in Russian snow. He thought about Japanese planes over Hawaii. And he understood, with a clarity that felt almost painful, how all the pieces fit together. Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union believing he could win quickly, decisively, before winter came. He had been wrong. And that mistake had given Stalin time to mobilize, to retreat, to survive, and now, finally, to fight back. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor believing they could cripple American naval power before the United States could respond. They might have succeeded tactically, but strategically, they had just guaranteed that the full industrial might of America would be turned against them. And Germany, bound by alliance to Japan, would declare war on the United States within days, adding a third front to a war they were already struggling to win on too. 3 gambles. 3 miscalculations. 3 moments where leaders had chosen aggression over caution, speed over sustainability, myth over reality. And now the equation had changed. Donovan picked up a red marker and drew a line connecting Washington to London to Moscow. The alliance wasn't formal yet. The coordination wasn't established. The trust wasn't built. But it would be. Because Germany and Japan had just made the same fatal mistake, they had assumed their enemies would break. Instead, they had united them. December 11, 1941. The news came over the radio at 3:47 p.m. Germany had declared war on the United States. Italy followed minutes later. Donovan listened to the announcement in his office, alone, the winter light fading outside his window. He thought about all the warnings he had sent, all the reports he had written, all the meetings where he had tried to explain that this war was coming whether America wanted it or not. None of it mattered now. The war was here. He walked to his map one final time and placed 3 pins, 1 in Washington, 1 in London, 1 in Moscow. The triangle was complete. The alliance was formed. And somewhere in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was realizing that he had just declared war on a nation with more industrial capacity than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Donovan allowed himself a small, grim smile. The Soviets had held at Moscow. The British had held at Britain. And now America would hold everywhere else. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be easy. Millions would die before it ended. But it would end. Because the equation had changed. And this time, the math was on their side.